Most people pick a campsite by how it looks the moment they arrive. Flat ground, a nice view, some trees for cover, and never find out if it holds until the one night it gets tested. A storm rolls in. A dry wash floods without warning. The temperature drops harder than the forecast promised. Suddenly, you're breaking camp in the dark while everyone around you scrambles too. 5 site types survive that night without a scramble. One is so ordinary, you probably walked right past it. The last one is the site most people avoid. And that instinct is backwards. I'm Ranger Jack. I've spent 17 years picking campsites for clients whose safety depends on me getting it right as a backcountry guide and outfitter. And I'm not selling gear or a course, just what actually holds up. Number 1, the elevated bench above the drainage line. Here's what you're looking for, not the valley floor, not the wide, flat basin that looks like the obvious place to pitch. You're looking for a raised terrace, a bench of ground, set just above a visible drainage channel, a dry wash, a shallow gully, anything that shows signs of moving water, even if it's bone dry right now. That elevation is the whole point. Valley floors and low basins look flattest and most sheltered, and that's exactly why they're dangerous. They're low ground, and low ground is where water goes. A storm 2 ridgelines away can send a wall of runoff down a channel that looked completely dead an hour earlier, and if your tent is on that channel's floor, you don't get a warning. You get water. This is where I run my own version of a ledger. Every trip I'm quietly cataloging which sites held and which ones didn't, not out of habit, but because the ground doesn't lie to you if you actually read it, and a dry wash lies to you constantly. It looks like the flattest, most obvious tent pad in the area. That's the trap. Sand and gravel get smoothed flat by exactly the kind of water you don't want to meet at 2 in the morning. The fix isn't complicated. Look for a bench, a shelf of ground raised even a few feet above the channel, ideally with vegetation that shows it doesn't flood regularly. That elevation buys you the one thing a valley floor can't: time to notice water rising before it reaches you. There are tells, if you know to look for them. Debris lines caught in low branches, sand and silt packed smooth in a way grass or scrub never grows through. A channel bed that's noticeably wider than the trickle of water actually running through it, or not running through it at all. Those are signs that the flat, dry, obvious spot has been underwater before and will be again. It's just a question of timing, not weather. A bench a few feet up doesn't have that history, and that's exactly why it's boring to look at and reliable to sleep on. Flat and safe are not the same word. Remember that one, because it's going to come up again. That one's easy to spot once you know what you're looking at. The next one takes more reading because it doesn't look dangerous at all. It looks like good sense. Number 2, the leeward shoulder, not the leeward gap. Everyone knows to camp on the sheltered side of something, a ridge, a rock outcrop, a stand of timber. That instinct is correct. Where people get it wrong is picking the gap instead of the shoulder. A narrow saddle, a notch between 2 rock masses, the low point between 2 hills. Those spots look like the most protected ground around, because right now, in calm conditions, they are. But terrain doesn't just block wind, it shapes it. And a gap doesn't block wind so much as squeeze it, the same way water speeds up through a narrow section of a channel. That saddle that felt still at 6 in the evening can turn into a wind tunnel the moment a front actually moves through. I know that one from the inside. Early in my guiding career, I approved a site in a notch like that on a calm, quiet evening. No wind, no red flags, nothing that looked wrong. A front came through overnight, and that gap did exactly what gaps do. It accelerated. We ended up relocating an entire group in the dark, in weather that had turned in a couple of hours, because I read the ground on a good hour instead of reading the shape of the terrain itself. That's not a mistake I've made twice. What I should have done, and what I do now on every single trip, is picture that same spot on the worst night of the season instead of the night I'm actually standing in it. A notch that funnels wind doesn't announce itself in calm conditions. There's nothing to see, nothing to hear, nothing that shows up on a quick look around. The only way to catch it is to read the shape of the land itself and ask where air would have to squeeze through if it had somewhere to be in a hurry. If the answer is right through where my tent is, that's the answer, regardless of how still it feels right now. The shoulder is different. That's the broad, protected face just off to the side of a ridge or rock mass, not tucked into the funnel, but far enough around the shape of the terrain that wind doesn't have a channel to accelerate through. Same general idea as camping in the lee, but positioned correctly instead of positioned for a nice, tight, photogenic pocket. Check the terrain shape, not just the current air. Calm weather tells you nothing about what that piece of ground does under pressure, and that one's already cost me a bad night. The next mistake looks even safer than this one. Number 3, timber edge, not timber center. Camping near trees for a windbreak is sound thinking. Camping deep inside a stand of trees tucked as far into the cover as you can get is where that sound thinking goes wrong. The edge of a healthy stand does real work. It breaks wind, it moderates how fast the temperature swings overnight, and it gives you a natural buffer without shutting you into the middle of the forest. That's the version you want. You're looking for a specific kind of spot, just inside the tree line, close enough that the canopy is cutting wind before it reaches you, but still able to see open sky, not fully enclosed by trunks on every side. That positioning gives you the wind protection and the temperature moderation without stacking as much overhead risk directly above your tent. And it usually means an easier, more obvious way out if you ever need one in a hurry. The center of the stand is where the actual hazard lives, and it's one almost nobody thinks to check for because it's not dramatic. It's just overhead. Standing dead trees and heavy leaning limbs, the kind guides and foresters call widowmakers, are a well-documented hazard in backcountry camping, and they're far more common in dense, older timber than people assume. A tree doesn't need a storm to fail. A dead limb can let go on a calm night for reasons that have nothing to do with weather. And deep in a stand, you've got more of those limbs over your head, not fewer, which is the opposite of what more tree cover implies. The fix is simple, and it takes about 30 seconds. Before you commit to a spot near trees, look up, not around, up. Check for dead wood, cracked limbs, obvious lean, anything hanging that shouldn't be. A healthy edge of green living timber gives you the windbreak without the overhead risk. That's the difference between using trees and hiding in them. Give the canopy a real look, not a glance. Dead branches often blend into the green around them until you're actually scanning for them. And a lean that looks stable from one angle can look completely different from 30 feet to the side. If a stand has a lot of standing dead wood scattered through it, old fire damage, beetle kill, drought stress, treat the whole area as suspect, even the parts that look fine, and move your sight to the cleaner edge instead of the compromised middle. Look up before looking down. That's the whole rule. That one requires actually checking the canopy, which most people skip because it feels like overkill for a campsite. This next one almost nobody thinks to check at all because it isn't about wind or trees or water. It's about the ground itself, and it's the most counterintuitive one on this list. Number 4, ground that doesn't pool cold air. This is the one that surprises people, including plenty of experienced campers who've never had a reason to think about it. You're looking for a site that sits slightly above the lowest point of a basin or hollow, not tucked into the very bottom of the dip, even though the bottom of a basin often looks like the coziest, most wind-sheltered spot around. Here's the mechanism. Cold air is heavier than warm air, and it drains downhill overnight the same way water does, settling and pooling in the lowest available point, a basin floor, a hollow, the bottom of a valley. That's a well-established phenomenon in alpine terrain, and it means the lowest, most tucked away, most protected spot in a basin can end up significantly colder overnight than ground just a little higher up the slope, even with identical gear and an identical forecast. You picked the site because it felt sheltered. It was sheltered from wind. It was not sheltered from cold, and those are two completely different problems that just happen to look the same from the trailhead. This is exactly the kind of thing my own ledger keeps proving out, trip after trip. The site that looked coziest on arrival is very often the one that gave a client the worst night's sleep, for a reason that had nothing to do with wind or rain at all. You can actually feel this one if you know to check for it. Walk the basin at dusk and pay attention to the air itself. The bottom will often feel noticeably heavier and colder than ground just 20 or 30 feet up the slope, sometimes well before the sun is even fully down. That temperature difference isn't your imagination, and it isn't going to correct itself overnight. It tends to get more pronounced as the night goes on and more cold air keeps draining down into the same low point. A site that felt merely cool at 8 o'clock can feel like a different climate entirely by 2 in the morning, and by then you're not relocating. You're just cold. Sheltered from wind isn't the same as sheltered from cold. That's the one that surprises most people, because it runs against the instinct to tuck yourself into the lowest, most enclosed spot you can find. The last one is the site most people actively avoid, and they're avoiding it for the wrong reason. Number 5. Bedrock, or a well-drained bench with 2 exits. This is the actual fortress site, and it's usually the one people walk right past, because it doesn't look like the comfortable choice. You're looking for solid, well-drained ground, bare bedrock, a gravel bench, hard-packed ground that isn't going to turn to mud or trap water, positioned with at least 2 realistic routes out, away from any known flood channel or slide run-out path, not 1 exit. 2. Here is why that combination matters more than anything else on this list. This is the site type that survives sustained bad weather instead of just tolerating a calm night. Solid, well-drained ground doesn't saturate the way soft, soil-heavy clearings do, so you're not sleeping in mud after 6 hours of rain. And having 2 viable ways out means that if conditions genuinely force you to move, a flooding drainage, a downed tree blocking one route, a storm cell that's clearly not passing, you're not trapped in a spot with a single compromised exit as your only option. People dismiss ground like this because it's less comfortable to look at. It's rockier. It's harder underfoot. It doesn't photograph like the soft, pretty clearing next to it with one easy trail in and out. But that soft clearing is optimizing for comfort on a good night, and this bench is optimizing for what happens on a bad one. Comfort and defensibility are different questions, and this is the site type that actually answers both, because solid ground under a decent pad is more comfortable than people expect, and it comes with a margin of safety the pretty clearing never had. The second exit part is the piece almost nobody thinks about until they need it. A single access clearing is fine right up until the one route in also becomes the one route out. And that route is exactly where the trouble is. A flooded crossing, a blocked trail, a slope that's no longer safe to descend. A site with a second way out isn't something you'll usually need. It's something you want to already have picked before you're standing in the dark, deciding whether tonight is the night you need it. This is the one I trust most, and it's usually the one people walk right past without a second look. On a real trip, this is the site I'll choose over a prettier option nearly every time, because a good night's sleep on slightly harder ground beats a rough night, or worse, a forced move at midnight on ground that only looked like the better choice. So here's the actual checklist, the one I run through myself before I let a client pitch a tent, and it's shorter than it sounds. Get above the drainage line, not on the flattest ground in the wash. Take the shoulder, not the gap, because calm air tells you nothing about what that terrain does under real wind. Camp on the edge of the timber, not buried inside it, and look up before you commit. Avoid the lowest point of a basin, because cold air pools exactly where the ground looks coziest. And when you can, take the solid, well-drained ground with 2 ways out over the soft, pretty clearing with 1. Notice what all 5 of these actually have in common. None of them are about finding the most scenic spot or the softest ground or the coziest looking pocket in the landscape. Every one of them is about picking ground based on how it behaves, not how it photographs. And that's the entire gap between a campsite that survives a bad night and one that just looks like it should. The 5 together aren't really 5 separate rules. Their one habit? Applied 5 times. Read the terrain for what it does under stress, not for what it looks like while nothing is happening. None of this replaces reading your specific terrain, your specific forecast, and your specific conditions on the day you're actually out there. Ground behaves differently depending on region, season, and what's happened in the days before you arrive. So treat this as the framework, not the final word, and confirm it against what you're actually seeing on site. That's not a disclaimer I say to cover myself. I don't have a shelter system or a gear line riding on any of this. I say it because I've watched confidence in a checklist replace an actual look at the ground. And that's how good campsites turn into bad nights. I've told you about the notch that turned into a wind tunnel on me years ago. I'd bet plenty of you have a version of that story too. A site that looked perfect walking in and turned into a problem you didn't see coming. Whether that was wind, water, cold, or just realizing too late that you'd boxed yourself in with nowhere to go. Tell me what it was and what you check for now that you wouldn't have back then. That's how this list got built in the first place, one bad night at a time, and it's still growing every season I keep guiding.